Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hope you're doing well. So we're continuing our reading of Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars. Forgive my niqab. It fresh out of the dryer. I don't put it immediately on the hanger. I lay it across the pillow, and it gets wrinkled so easily. So pardon me on that. We are continuing our reading of this section of Gaius Julius Caesar, and he is one of my favorites in history. I had a statue of him, but when I converted to Islam, I know you can't have statues like that, so I got rid of it. But it was one of my favorites because I've read his biography. I've read Caesar's Gallic Wars. I'm totally into that guy and what he did. And this, take it with a grain of salt, okay? Obviously, Suetonius is going to give his perspective on the histories. So some of it may be true, some of it may have a little bit of exaggeration or minimization, but either way we learn something quite cool, right? Okay. Here's the next part about him. He administered justice with the utmost conscientiousness and strictness. Those convicted of extortion he even dismissed from the senatorial order. So if you were a senator and you were convicted of extortion, you couldn't keep your job. He annulled the marriage of an ex-praetor who had married a woman the very day after her divorce. Oh, jeez. Oh, my goodness. Although there was no suspicion of adultery. In Islam, you have to wait, right? If a woman's divorced, you have to wait 3 periods, her ida, her waiting period, right? Make sure she's not pregnant before you can marry her. But, geez. Oh, that's kind of a fast marriage, wouldn't you say? He imposed duties on foreign wars. He denied the use of litters and the wearing of scarlet robes or pearls to accept those of designated position and age on set days. Now that's interesting. So a litter is when, you're in this carriage and people can carry you. I think that's the traditional understanding of a litter. And so the Roman nobles wouldn't walk in the street, they'd be carried in a litter. And so, apparently, you couldn't use a litter unless you were not one of the nobles. Scarlet robes and pearls. Fascinating. So he regulated wardrobe. It's quite interesting. In particular, he enforced the law against extravagance, setting watchmen in various parts of the market to seize and bring to him dainties which were exposed for sale in violation of the law. And sometimes he sent his lictors and soldiers to take from a dining room any article which had escaped the vigilance of his watchmen, even after they had been served. Interesting. Extravagance laws. Dainties. Now, dainties seems like little fancy plates and extravagantly ornate objects. Now that's fascinating too, because having your lictors, the lictors, they had this stick, and the soldiers were more armed. So having lictors and soldiers removing people who violated the law. Quite fascinating. In particular, for the adornment and convenience of the city, also for the protection and extension of the empire. Protection and extension of the empire. He formed more projects and more extensive ones every day. So he seems to be someone who was really into doing public works. First of all, to rear a temple to Mars, greater than in any existence. So here we see he wanted to do religious things. Too bad he wasn't a Muslim, but Mars was the god of war. And it's interesting that he, as a soldier who conquered Gaul, wanted to make a very nice temple for the god of war. Fascinating. Greater than any in existence, filling up and leveling the pool in which he had exhibited the sea fight. So remember that there were some fun navy battles. It'd be kind of cool to have that today, to be honest. They would fill up these pools and then have these real cool battles that people got to watch. That'd be pretty cool, man. And to build a theater of vast size, sloping down from the Tarpeian rock. To reduce the civil code to fixed limits. Interesting, reducing the civil code to fixed limits. And of the vast and prolix mass of statues to include only the best and most essential in a limited number of volumes. Now that's interesting. The statues should only be essential and they should only be the best. Nice. There's a lot of modern art that is like forced upon us, and you're like, who put this up? It's a piece of trash. But it does, I mean, us Muslims, we're not going to have that kind of statuary because of the, iconoclastic type of mode we have, which is justified because remember when we learned about Prophet Noah, may Allah be pleased with him, and how there were wise men in his generation, and when the people died and the next generation came, they started worshipping those statues. We learned about that in Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's Removal of Doubts book, on my second channel, Bibliophile Hermit. Remember? And so that's why the statuaries of wise people should not be built. So I understand from an Islamic perspective we wouldn't do it. However, from his context, we can see that he wanted to have the nicest art and not just any art like today. And I know the art majors are going to get mad and say, what is art? What is beauty? Don't challenge me to philosophy. To open the public the greatest possible libraries of the Greek and Latin books. Now this is something that I love. So he wants to increase the libraries. So he wants to build a huge temple to Mars, make it real nice. And now he's really making sure that the Greek and Latin books and the libraries are really well. So he is doing a lot of extensive projects consistently during his rulership. It's really quite fascinating. The fact that he regulated litters and clothes and seizing dainties and sending his lictors and soldiers, he's very active. He wasn't just drinking himself away. It's quite telling, isn't it? Assigning to Marcus Varro the charge of procuring and classifying them. Okay, so Marcus Varro, we're going to have to learn more about him. But he was in charge of picking the books, classifying them, and getting them into the shelves. To drain the Pomptine marshes, to let out water from Lake Fucinus, to make a highway from the Adriatic across the summit of the Apennines as far as the Tiber, to cut a canal through Isthmus. Ooh, canal projects, infrastructure projects. To check the Dacians who had poured into Pontus and Thrace. Then to make war on the Parthians by way of Lesser Armenia, but not to risk a battle with them until he had first tested their mettle. Interesting. So making war, planning to have a war with the Parthians. Fascinating. All these enterprises and plans were cut short by his death. But before I speak of that, it will not be amiss to describe briefly his personal appearance, his dress, his mode of life, and his character, as well as his conduct in civil and military life. Yeah, imagine what he would have done if he wasn't assassinated by the very people he forgave. That's what's brutal. I couldn't imagine being shanked by a group of people on the Senate floor. And especially by Brutus, someone whom he forgave. It's so sad. It's crazy. He has said to have been tall of stature, with fair complexion, shapely limbs, and somewhat full face, and keen black eyes. So that's interesting. So Gaius Julius Caesar had brownish blackish eyes. Very keen, a very piercing gaze. Some people might have thought he had blue eyes or green eyes. Wrong. Sound of health, except that towards the end which was subject to sudden fainting fits, and to nightmare as well. So interesting. This mentions his seizures. Caesar having seizures. Yeah, where he has those shaking fits. He was twice attacked by the falling sickness during his campaigns, He was somewhat overnice in the care of his person by not being only carefully trimmed and shaved, but even having superfluous hair plucked out. That's interesting. So he was very hygienic. I wonder, not too many Romans had beards on their coins. They like to have a shaved face. I like beards. Well, his baldness was a disfigurement which troubled him greatly. So he had some hair thinning for a while as he got older. Pretty common for white people. Since he found that it was often the subject of the gibes of his detractors. So what that gibes of his detractors means, people used to make fun of his baldness, so it kind of got him insecure. Because of it, he used to comb forward his scanty locks from the crown of his head, so he tried to cover his bald spot. And that's just fascinating because he is a conqueror. He is the leader of a vast empire. And he still gets insecure about his hair. You see what I'm saying? And of all the honors voted him by the Senate and the people, there was none which he received or made use of more gladly than the privilege of wearing a laurel wreath at all times. Oh, so the laurel wreath, maybe he wore it to help cover his bald spot, or at least distract from it, right? They say too that he was a fantastic in his dress, that he wore a senator's tunic with fringed sleeves reaching to the wrist, and always had a girdle over it. I wonder if the girdle was kind of like armor, though rather a loose one. And this, they say, was the occasion of Sulla's mot, when he often warned the nobles to keep an eye on the ill-girt boy. That's interesting. So he got to live during the time of Sulla, so he knew about assassins and such, and that Sulla said, look out for this guy, and Sulla was right in a way, right? He lived at first in the Suburra in a modest house, but after he became Pontifex Maximus, in the official residence on the Sacred Way, many have written that he was very fond of elegance and luxury. So at first he kind of was more modest, and then as he became Pontifex Maximus, he got a little bit more spendy. That having laid the foundations of a country house on his estate at Nemi, and finished it at great cost, he tore it all down because it did not suit him in particular. That's weird. See, that I would wonder. You see what I'm saying? Why would you build something and then just tear it down? Something like that is when I would wonder if Suetonius is being a bit biased. Although at the time he was still poor and heavily in debt. See, that wouldn't make sense though. Why would you tear it down if you're in debt? Who knows? And he carried tessellated and mosaic floors about with him on his campaigns. Interesting. So, carrying mosaic floors, maybe he had this idea he was going to transfer them or copy the patterns to put on his own floor, because the Romans did like mosaic floors. If you look through history, they really did like it. Some of them are quite pretty and preserved. They say that he had led to invade Britain by the hope of getting pearls. Man, the resources they fought over is quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, today we do that. Cobalt, coltan, iron. Like, people invade for minerals in a different type of way, right? That he always was most enthusiastic collector of gems, carvings, statues, and pictures by early artists. So he was an art enthusiast. Interesting. Also of slaves of exceptional figure and training at enormous prices. Also, he wanted to have these really cool fit slaves, like really great warriors, of which he himself was so ashamed that he forbade the entry into his accounts. Well, that's interesting. So he was ashamed that he spent a lot of money on very well-trained, exceptional figured slaves. It is quite interesting that the people who bought gladiators, obviously, probably very, very wealthy, and those who trained them as well, picking out a superior body figure, training them up, and then selling them to fight in the Colosseum and other rings must have fetched a great price. It's quite fascinating how these people who fought in the Colosseum were all races and they were slaves, every single one. And they had to fight leopards, be on chariots and fight soldiers, reenact wars, all kinds of stuff. It is further reported that in the provinces he gave banquets constantly in 2 dining halls, in one of which his officers or Greek companions, and the other Roman civilians, and more distinguished of the provincials reclining at the table. Okay, so he gave frequent banquets. I like sharing food. I don't see something wrong with that. I don't see anything wrong with that. He was so punctilious and strict in the management of his household, in some matters as well as in those of great importance. But that he put his baker in irons for serving him with one kind of bread, and his guests another. Okay, now that one is interesting. You could look at that in multiple ways. Did Caesar get better bread than his guests? Because you'd want them to have all the same bread. You don't want to insult your guests to be like, you get this one, I get this one. But we can imagine that some people might have punished their servants in such a way. But it could also be exaggerated. So let's not just automatically believe that. And he inflicted capital punishment on a favorite freedman for adultery with the wife of a Roman knight, although no complaint was made against him. That's interesting. So he gave the death penalty to a man. He was a freedman, so he was a former slave, and he slept with a knight's wife, a Roman knight's wife, and got the death penalty. So even under the Romans, there were some serious penalties for adultery, not just amongst the religious communities. I think a lot of people were quite unaware of that, I must say. Fascinating, man. So he had a healthy, demeanor, a little bit of thinning hair, liked to wear the laurel wreath in order to kind of distract from that. Had some, seizures a couple times in his life. Wanted to invade Britain in hopes of getting some pearls. Must have been fancy. Yet he also regulated who could wear pearls and scarlet robes and use litters and such, that you had to actually be of status to have such things. So they clearly wanted the differentiation between the plebeians and those of the aristocracy, which, I don't mind that. That's what they want to do. But he had lictors and soldiers to seize and bring him dainties which were exposed in the market. So it's quite interesting. It wasn't exactly a free market economy. There was still regulation, right? Then he wanted to build the temple to Mars to be very extravagant and great. He leveled the pool that had the sea fights in it. But he wanted to cut a canal through Isthmus. He put Marcus Varro in charge of procuring and classifying Greek and Latin texts so that the libraries could be very advanced and well described. Very fascinating. Had keen black eyes, so brownish black. That's very important to know, because I'm pretty sure there'll be some woke-tardian who will try to call him a blue-eyed devil or some nonsense. Fascinating history. Hope you learned something. Have a good day.